Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this world of ours. I hope you're safe and, of course, well. I'm Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of conversations on issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today, we're going to talk Ukraine. It's fascinating. Ukraine's surprise offensive in Kursk, at least momentarily, seemed to shift the prevailing narrative about a grinding war of attrition, and it's bolstered Ukrainian morale. But at the same time, it's not at all clear that it has affected Putin's strategic calculation about a war of attrition that he perhaps believes he can still win. Uncertainty about the outcome of US elections, a reduced sense of urgency about the war itself, shakes a good deal of confidence about whether the current US and Western policy with respect to the Russian-Ukraine war is on a sustainable footing. Nor, it seems to me, are there even the remotest prospects of any serious negotiations that might pause, let alone end the confrontation. After all, in order for negotiations to succeed, you need a minimum of two parties who are willing and able, a sense of urgency. And if we're talking about a substantive breakthrough, then you need a framework that somehow meets the mutual needs and requirements of each side. None of those elements seem to be in place right now. So I guess the question is many questions. Is a long war, because it clearly looks that way, is a long war sustainable? Have the US and Europe developed the right mix of policy tools and overall strategy to help prosecute the long war and what appears to be an open-ended confrontation with Moscow? More questions than answers, but I can think of no two better humans on the planet than Dara Massicot and Ciaramella to answer them, and above all, to provide clear and honest analysis, even though clear and honest analysis often leads to paralysis, about what U.S. options are as we go forward. They deserve long introductions. Let me briefly summarize for those of you who don't know them. Eric is a senior fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment. He focuses on Ukraine and Russia. Prior to joining Carnegie, Eric served for 12 years in the U.S. government as an intelligence analyst and policy official. He was Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the NIC, the National Intelligence Council, where he helped lead the intelligence community's strategic analysis on the former Soviet Union. He also served as NSC staff, on the NSC staff, first as director for Ukraine, and then as acting senior director for Europe and Russia. He was also a senior political analyst at CIA, where he specialized in Europe and the former Soviet Union. Dara is a senior fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program at Carnegie. Her work focuses on defense and security issues in Russia and Eurasia. Prior to joining Carnegie, Dara was a senior policy researcher at RAND and senior analyst for Russian military capabilities at the Department of Defense. She has published extensively on Russian military capabilities, modernization efforts, and strategy, and is a preeminent expert on the Russo-Ukrainian war. So more questions than answers, but let me begin. I interviewed the two of you in January, and I asked you what I thought was, for a non-expert, a pretty elemental but maybe foundational question, and that is, how do you describe this war? What something is called is critically important to how it's perceived, and perhaps what you actually do about it. So, how would you describe it? We bandied about terms in January: frozen conflict, stalemate, hurting stalemate, grinding war of attrition. It's now the fall of 2024. Eric, let's start with you. Briefly define this war.
Hi, Aaron. Well, great to be with you. I think that the war has been for a long time a grinding war of attrition. I don't think it's frozen, clearly. The battlefield is still highly dynamic with high intensity operations going on every day. And I don't think it's a stalemate per se, because each side is still looking for opportunities to exploit, to significantly change their position on the battlefield and build leverage for, eventual negotiations if and when they do occur. And again, with the Kursk offensive, it is a reminder that the war does still have dynamism and the outcome is not necessarily entirely predictable. So I do think that when you look at the fight in the East, certainly that is a grinding war of attrition. Dara can talk much more about what's going on the front lines. But I would add, since January, we have had these couple of major developments, which are, number one, the sustained Russian campaign to destroy Ukraine's energy infrastructure that has had a strategic character in that it has significantly, hampered Ukraine's economic kind of recovery during wartime, and has posed a lot of challenges for the Ukrainian leadership in preparation for the coming winter. And then the Kursk operation, which I know we'll talk about in a bit more detail later in the event, but it does remind that, again, there is this, huge front line and battlefield in the East where the positions are not really, changing at a very noticeable pace, although Ukraine has been retreating in the areas around Pokrovsk in recent weeks due to the sustained Russian onslaught. But that still, there are ways for the war to move in sort of unpredictable directions.
Right. Dara, to you, there is this term, hurting stalemate. And I suspect the war is hurting both Ukraine and Russia, but the degree of pain doesn't seem evident in producing any major change in the trajectory of the conflict or either side's willingness to consider an alternative to military confrontation. So is grinding war of attrition where we left it in January about where we are now?
That is what I would say of those choices that you offered. It is a grinding war of attrition. There is exhaustion on both sides, but they're both still willing to commit forces to defend on the Ukrainian side and attack on the Russian side. And I would say it's not a stalemate. We do not have two parties that are fully dug in. The Russians are of course, more dug in eastern Ukraine than the Ukrainians are even still since January. But both sides are introducing new capabilities all of the time and countering them at incredibly quick rates now. And just to give you one example, I don't know if the audience has seen, but the Ukrainians introduced a drone that's capable of dropping thermite and causing fires in trench lines. It's called the Dragon drone. The Russians saw that for about 2 weeks, and then they started introducing their own. So we are in this cycle where everyone is trying to find the magic combination of capabilities and skill to try to change the situation on the battlefield. It is not a frozen conflict at all, even though there's not much movement along most of the line. So I agree with what Eric has said. That manpower is, I think, the critical issue for the Ukrainians. And although the weapons situation has certainly improved very much since we last spoke in January, the manpower situation remains critical for the Ukrainian military.
Yeah. One more question on perceptions before we move into the battlefield itself. You're both analysts. You both had experience in government where you provided information on which decisions are made to people who actually make the decisions. But watching this war almost 3 years later in February of 2025, I guess it'll be the third year of the war. Looking back now, as analysts, not as policy advisors or decision makers, what has surprised you the most about this conflict? Derek, can I go to you first?
Sure, absolutely. And I've said variants of this before, but it's still surprising to me in some ways that this has not ever been fully a conflict between two parties alone. Ukraine has had a lot of support from the West, a lot of support from the United States, support that was not possible for many reasons 10 years ago. And that support is critical. It is not fully publicly understood, the extent, quantitatively and qualitatively. And so it's hard to describe it, but there are amazing things that have happened and are still happening that I never thought that I would see would happen. Now, what that did was it made it a little difficult to forecast the war in advance, not knowing how that support would so sharply pivot after the war began and how it began to influence very significant dynamics that we're still seeing play out. So I know that's kind of a squishy answer, but it is changing. You know, it changed how this war, how we looked at it and understood that what that war is not what we thought the parties would be going into it, if that makes sense.
Right, but if I understand you correctly, the thing that surprised you most was not the behavior necessarily of Russia and Ukraine, but in terms of Ukraine, the external nature of the support. You saw things that you thought you might never see. I assume that focused primarily on the U.S. role.
It focused on a lot of roles in the West, and this is information that people have talked about, you know, in the last 2 years. But just the nature of the planning and the intelligence support in particular.
Yeah. Eric, to you now, as an analyst, what surprised you the most?
I mean, I think I was not surprised by Ukrainians' willingness to fight for their country and their ability to come together. I think what surprised me maybe is the extremely smart decisions they made early in the war and the really stupid decisions, frankly, that the Russians made to put the war on a completely different trajectory than it could have been if those initial few days and weeks had gone differently. Mm-hmm. And so I think, you know, going into it, and I remember these conversations back in government in the lead up to February 24th, when people were making predictions about how the war would go. You know, I knew the Ukrainians would fight, having studied Ukraine for a very long time. I just didn't think that they would have the success that they did and the Russians would have the failures that they did. And to Dara's point, that the United States and Europe would actually lean so far forward in supporting Ukraine. I mean, the idea of sending even artillery, let alone, you know, Abrams tanks and F-16s and all this other stuff, ATACMS, before February 24th was totally preposterous.
Yeah,
we wrung our hands for years over Javelin anti-tank missiles, and that's old history. And we've moved so far in the direction of, you know, equipping the Ukrainians with a suite of modern capabilities, helping them plan, like Dara was saying, the intelligence support. I mean, it's really unprecedented in modern history. There's nothing anywhere close to the example of what we've managed to do. And I think when you bring all those three factors together, Russian mistakes, Ukrainian quick thinking and ingenuity, and American and European support, you get a completely different war than anyone would have predicted on February 23rd.
Yeah, I mean, the will to fight for sure, but the will to fund. And we're going to get to that a little bit later in the conversation. All right, to the battlefield. Now, I mean, I get most of my battlefield analysis from Mike Kaufman, Rob Lee, and the things that the two of you write. But there was an interesting overview piece, New York Times reported last week, that not since the early days of the war have the lines shifted as dynamically as they have in the past several weeks. I assume they were talking about the Russian gains in the east, in and around Pokrovsk, and the Kursk offensive. So for normal humans that are not that familiar with the topography and the battle lines, let's just take briefly each of these sort of new dynamic situations. Eric, can I ask you to look at the Russian and Ukrainian strategy in the east, and then Dara, I'd like you to take on, as you've done so well elsewhere, just the highlights of the Kursk offensive. Eric, so what about Pokrovsk? Is it now the new fulcrum of Western civilization? We hear the names of these places, Bakhmut earlier in the year. Now it's Pokrovsk. How much does this matter? Are these strategic objectives? Could this create a new trajectory if the Russians succeed in breaking through? What does this mean?
So I'll start with just 30 seconds of background, for listeners. So The last time we had a real significant shift in the lines was the fall of 2022, when Ukraine launched these successful counteroffensives to push the Russians out of Kharkiv Oblast and to retake the city of Kherson and push the Russians back to the left bank of the Dnipro. Throughout 2023, the battle lines were pretty static, and Ukraine was preparing for this major counteroffensive in the south and the east, with the goal of severing Russia's land bridge to Crimea, making it to the Sea of Azov, and tilting the battlefield in Ukraine's favor. As everyone is probably remembering, that counteroffensive was not successful. The Ukrainians made very, very marginal gains, many of which have subsequently been erased. And it proved to be extremely difficult to overcome Russia's prepared defenses that had been built since the setbacks that Russia had faced in the fall of 2022, these trenches, minefields, fortifications, and so on. So after the Ukrainian counteroffensive, there was definitely this kind of sense of gloom in Kyiv and among the partners that, Ukraine had reached its sort of high point and that it would just be continued Russian gains from there. At the same time, we had this political dynamic in our country where, the aid package, the supplemental aid package, was being held up in Congress for 6 months. And what that did is it put Ukraine in an even worse position in terms of air defense interceptors, in terms of artillery munitions, and really just general morale of seeing that we were completely frozen in our process and unable to equip them for even basic defense. Then Russia started these infrastructure attacks and continued pushing in the east. So that gets us to the summer. And what happened was, for a variety of reasons that hopefully Dara can elaborate on as well, the Ukrainians had trouble, regenerating their forces, which have been on, seeing combat now for 2 years uninterrupted. Again, they had an equipment problem from us because we were delayed so long in our decisions. They waited a long time to build fortifications on their side, kind of hoping throughout 2023 that they would be able to go on the offensive and that they wouldn't want to fortify their own positions because they were hoping to liberate some of their land. And then on mobilization and personnel, which Dara has mentioned, the Ukrainian leadership waited a long time to really get this mobilization sort of in order because it was a politically very sensitive issue when there was no concept of how these forces would be employed and what there was besides this grinding war of attrition. So was it just a death warrant, basically, for people who would be conscripted? So I think it put the Ukrainians in a really disadvantageous position and really, sort of weakened their front lines. And Russia has been able to exploit those weaknesses, with kind of continued moves around this city of Pokrovsk that you mentioned. In my view, it's not the fulcrum of Western civilization, just as Bakhmut wasn't. I don't think any particular place in Eastern Ukraine really is. Ukraine as a state will certainly survive without Pokrovsk. However, it is significant in that it's the last major population center on the road to the Ukrainian industrial heartland, Dnipro, Zaporizhzhia, and elsewhere. And, those are places that Ukraine obviously can't afford to lose. And so there is a worry that Ukraine doesn't have enough second, third lines of defense to be able to, blunt any Russian move after Pokrovsk, towards the west, towards Dnipro. Though, Russia is still expending significant resources just to take Pokrovsk. It's probably still, a few months away if they manage to take it. And so, I still don't think, even if Pokrovsk falls to the Russians, that there would be any significant kind of lightning offensive beyond there.
Okay, Dara, to you, an enormous amount of figurative ink has been spilled on the Kursk offensive. Can you just summarize for us what your reading of Ukrainian objectives are, how they're doing, and in the end, what does Kursk actually represent, in your view, the most significant takeaway?
Well, there is a relationship between what's going on in Pokrovsk right now and what's going on in Kursk. So just to pick up from Eric's excellent analysis, Ukrainian brigades to the tune of maybe 3 or 4 brigade elements were moved out of that region and some other areas nearby to deploy to Kursk. So that has left the Pokrovsk area slightly weaker in the onslaught that Russia is putting against it now. Now, the Ukrainians are trying to move and adjust and reinforce Pokrovsk, but there is a connection. There's not a lot of spare slack in the Ukrainian system in terms of brigades who can have fighting capacity and be able to move. Long story short, about a month ago, they led a pretty audacious assault into the Russian Federation, and they exploited a very weak area of the border where no one had clear command and control authority, or they should have, but it wasn't anything that the Russians certainly anticipated that Ukraine would be so bold to do. They made a lot of rapid gains in the early weeks, and now it's settling into something a little more static. There are villages that trade off on a daily basis up in Kursk. The Russians have gotten themselves together after their characteristic, freezing in place for about a week or two. They have now developed a response. And so we've seen in the last week Russian mechanized assaults on the sides of this salient. So they're going to try to pinch it in and then probably try to hit it from the top. So there was a morale boost from this incursion, and it was not just among Ukrainian units, it was among people in Ukraine that they had the ability to do this and surprise the Russians. The Russians are not this monolith that can never be beaten, and it is fragile in some ways. But if this operation does not meet success, that morale can quickly shift to something quite negative. And me as a military analyst, my immediate questions about it were, how do they plan on reinforcing this? What is the plan for logistics? And if needed, what is the extraction plan or the egress plan? Because as we know, Ukrainian POWs are treated horribly in Russian captivity, tortured and everything else. So those were my concerns as a military analyst, thinking about how this can unfold. On the bright side, there has been capture of significant numbers of Russian personnel. And the Ukrainians have already done 2 very large POW swaps as a result of this, because there are many Russian conscripts among those groups taken from Russia. And this is very sensitive for Putin. He wants them back. So Russia and Ukraine have been able to do those 2 swaps. And I don't need to remind us of what we're seeing here, but we have to call it out for what it is. These Ukrainian soldiers are being tortured and they are being starved in captivity. That is a violation of the Geneva Convention, and it's a war crime.
Yeah. Just to give us a sense, are the numbers of troops deployed for this offensive somewhere around, 10 to 15,000? Is that a reasonable number?
Yes, that's what I've seen. And then I've seen the Russian forces that are allocated against it somewhere in the 30 to 40,000 number. But I want to caveat who they are. They are a mixture of conscripts who have over 4 months of basic training, and that's about it. Some don't even have that. Some VDV elements that have been redeployed from other areas in Ukraine, not necessarily the Pokrovsk salient, unfortunately, and some internal security troops. And all that means is that these are not units that naturally work well together. So they're going to try to do assaults on this group, and it's going to look a bit messy because they don't really have a common command picture before this particular event. So it's messy.
I want to turn now to the broader question of changing calculations, if there have been any, on the part of both Putin and Zelensky. Again, almost 3 years in February 2025. Our colleague at Carnegie, Alexander Sasha Gabuyev, has written that Putin's calculations remain basically unchanged. He still believes he can win this war. Sasha goes on to say that Putin's war is now Russia's war, which is an intriguing formulation, and makes the point that in the border areas where Ukraine has retaliated, Russian support for the war is now 10 to 15% higher than it is as a norm, which is roughly 60%. So let's first get to Putin, because Dara, you've just come out with a fascinating study that speaks to the issue of mass mobilization on the part of the Russians and the constraints that imposes, which is a critical component for Putin. So can you briefly comment on whether you think Putin's calculations have changed and how the manpower issue that figures so singularly in your study, why that's such a critical variable on the Russian side?
Well, thank you so much. Yes, no, we just published a report on Russian military reconstitution because even though they are very much engaged in this war, we have to think about what comes next for them. And because it matters for Ukraine, it matters for NATO, and they're already starting to put some pieces in place. And it's not just about reproducing tanks, it's about recruiting and retaining that force. And just yesterday, the Russians announced that they would be expanding the military from 1.32 million to 1.5 million. And we talk about that in the report and how many constraints that imposes on them to try to continue to expand this force. They have to find the money to rebuild the tanks. They have to find the money to pay all of these people at a time when there's significant pressure on that defense budget. Even though the defense budget's larger, it can only accommodate so much. So in my research, something jumped out to me that Putin actually has more resources that he can grab. And he's not grabbing them, whether that's via mobilization or whether that's changing Russian law to allow Russian women to work in the defense industrial base, because there's many jobs that they cannot work in right now because it is believed it will harm their fertility. There's all sorts of choices that he is not making. And it tells me that he wants to keep this war on the simmer from his perspective, that it is, rather than upset the tension in Russian society by dialing things up even more than they are, whether that's overheating the economy or doing another round of mobilization or changing the labor code. To this point, he has not wanted to do that. So that tells me that domestic stability for him is number one. And so when I hear him say that this is an existential war for Russia, that is not reflected in the choices that he has made so far. So I think we should keep that in mind as we hear these kind of statements.
It's a fascinating point. But do you agree with Sasha, with Alexander Kabuyev's point that Putin still believes and is confident, to the extent we can know his confidence level, that if he just keeps at it, that the West will somehow lose interest, lose heart? American electoral politics could conceivably play to his advantage. Is he still confident he can win?
I think he has an understanding that those goals that he wanted at the beginning of this war are not really attainable for him right now from a material perspective. The Russian military cannot retake Kyiv. That's just not possible. I think we're looking for the rest of this month, the rest of this calendar year, an assault on Pokrovsk and maybe a little farther, and then they have to stop and repair and refit themselves. So I think he understands that. But since he has illegally claimed 4 regions of Ukraine, I think that's the bare minimum that he thinks that he deserves. So I think that's probably an intermediate objective for him based on what I'm seeing.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Eric, can I ask you to unpack for us Zelensky's? My sort of rudimentary reaction is somehow Zelensky has no internal politics. He acts. Ukraine is Zelensky. Zelensky is Ukraine. Obviously, that's inaccurate. There have to be politics. Zelensky's under internal constraints. Have those shaped or reshaped his calculations with respect to the war?
Yeah, I mean, there's there's definitely still plenty of politics in Ukraine. But the wartime consensus that he is the leader, even though his first presidential term technically expired in May, that during martial law you can't have elections, and he's still the commander in chief. And even the opposition to him in parliament, in the Rada, agrees that there can't be elections right now. And they have rallied around him as the commander in chief, while disagreeing with some of his domestic decisions on certain issues. I think it's wrong to characterize his decision making as, the kind of the thinking of one man and the fact that he's in charge and this is just his war. I think he is reflecting views that are widely held in Ukrainian society, and he's a close student of public opinion polling, and he certainly has seen that over the course of 2024, there has been a certain fatigue setting in Ukrainian society. And we had our own poll that we fielded and wrote up at the Carnegie Endowment that was looking at Ukrainians' views of the war and potential negotiations and outcomes and so on and so forth. And what we found was that definitely at a top level, there is a growing exhaustion. I mean, it's, obvious and understandable after 2.5 years of this brutal war. But when you really dig down and you start to ask about, potential concessions and the conditions for a negotiation and whether there's any trust in Russia to uphold a deal, what would happen to Ukraine if there were a ceasefire? Would the West stay the course and, stick with Ukraine, or would it cut and run? I mean, there's still significant, I would say, distrust in Ukrainian society of both the Russians and Western staying power. And there is significant resistance to any of the main concessions that, Russia's been demanding. And so, you have this top line view of fatigue, but there's no real ingredients here for any change of course to get to some sort of ceasefire. And so as I've been watching Zelensky, he's been, through this kind of summitry with the Swiss Peace Summit and some of the talk about a new kind of peace plan or revisited version of the 10-point peace formula. I think he's trying to move the needle a little bit on articulating not necessarily what a final settlement would look like, but at least the pathway to get there and what Ukraine would need on the long-term security side. Hopefully we can talk a little bit more about that because it's mostly in our control, the West, about what we can provide for Ukraine in terms of this, long-term policy framework to give them the confidence they would need if they ever walked into the room with the Russians.
Right. I want to use the time that remains to deal with two issues. Both are highly political issues. First is the issue of red lines. And I wonder if both of you can help me unpack what is clearly one of the most fiercely debated issues regarding this war. And that's the issue of risk aversion on the part of the United States versus risk readiness when it comes to Putin's supposed red lines. Zelensky said last month, quote, "The whole naive, illusory concept of so-called red lines regarding Russia, which dominated the assessment of the war by some partners," I wonder who he had in mind, "has crumbled," unquote. That's Zelensky on red lines. Does he have a point? Have we been bluffed to the degree, because understandably we want to avoid escalation, nuclear power after all? But does Zelensky have a point? Has the administration been too risk averse when it comes to providing Ukraine with more of what it needs as a consequence of what has turned out, seems to me, to be Putin's bluster? Dara?
Well, I think the administration has been clear from the start of this that they had two conditions. One was no American boots on the ground in Ukraine, and we're not fighting a war with Russia. And maybe the language is a little different, but those two principles still hold true. And I think that to add some nuance to this conversation, I think there are two different baskets of escalation here, because we've seen the Ukrainians strike really sensitive targets inside Russia, from anything from the Kremlin to the airfields, to the Black Sea Fleet, to ballistic missile early warning radars with their own organic capabilities. And the Russian response has been to retaliate with missile strikes on Ukraine, or in some cases, when it's too embarrassing, just not do anything at all. Now, I want to caveat, that's with Ukrainian targeting, Ukrainian origin weapons. That is what we know about. That's the Russian behavior that we know about. We know about Russian behavior vis-a-vis Storm Shadow and ATACMS strikes on Crimea and in occupied Ukraine. It was more of the same kind of response. So we know about that response. What we don't know about, and this is what Putin is trying to shape the debate and shape the conversation with some of his statements, is about a American or NATO role in precision strikes inside Russia.
Yes.
We don't know what their response is, but I've looked into many general staff nightmares, okay, over the years. And the types of targets that Ukraine can hit with ATACMS inside Russia, things like air bases or military bases or this and that, come nowhere close to my understanding of Russian doctrine on this point. They simply cannot, with the number of ATACMS that we have or Storm Shadows provided, put the existence of the Russian state at stake, or any of those other nuclear doctrinal red lines. But I note that escalation is a political decision. And in many ways, the Russians have already escalated, not kinetically with missile strikes on NATO bases, but there is a whole pattern of Russian intelligence activity that is underway in Europe against military bases in Germany, Norway, Finland, Sweden. You can track them all down. It's all discussed in the press, or at least some of them are discussed in the press. That is a form of escalation. It's just not symmetric. So I think if we're having this conversation about will Putin escalate or will he not, it's not necessarily pointing missiles at NATO. It's these kind of activities ratcheting up to a much higher level than we're seeing even at present, which is elevated.
Right. Although you would think those would be within the range of our absorptive capacity, should we decide, and no decision has been made yet, to provide Ukrainians. Well, Storm Shadow, we basically agreed, in part because Storm Shadow relies on U.S. technology and GPS or satellite imagery. Or if I got that wrong, I mean, why do the Brits need our approval on Storm Shadow? I mean, there's got to be some U.S. supplied something in those weapon systems.
Yeah, I'm not sure the technical specifics on that or the ability to talk about that, but
when it comes to ATACMS, they're going to make a decision one way or the other. Sort of the pros outweigh the cons. I mean, I've heard all kinds of contingency factors. We don't have enough ATACMS. We have commitments to our allies abroad. We can't give them enough ATACMS to make a difference. The Russians have moved their high-value targets beyond the range of the ATACMS. What do you think our real fear is here? It's not that the Russians are going to start sabotaging NATO bases through their own black ops. What's the real fear on the part of the United States if we push Putin too far? And is it real?
Well, these are questions to pose to the administration. But what I can say about it, I know. But what I can say about it, if I was in the hot seat, is that it's not a risk-free proposition.
Yep.
But watching their behavior, I don't think that this results in them retaliating kinetically against NATO. And there's a simple reason for that, and that's losing control. Putin would be losing control. And his number one motivation is maintaining control. So that's just my 2 cents. But I think it is also worth having a conversation about what ATACMS can realistically achieve at this point. Not that it should be used as a decision to withhold them, but just be realistic about what's happening here. The Russians have relocated a lot of those aircraft that can fire those FAB bombs on Ukraine. That doesn't mean that Ukraine shouldn't have ATACMS for that reason. There's other targets.
Right.
The Russians do have technical capabilities now that they're getting better at jamming ATACMS and making them less effective. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't give them, but it just means be realistic that some of these aren't going to make it. They won't make it through. So
I'll ask both of you the question tied to what the Russian deputy foreign minister said a week or so ago when he talked about Russia revising its nuclear weapons doctrine, right, to expand to, quote, non-existential threats, like a conventional military attack. I'm assuming neither of you believe that Putin would use a tactical nuclear weapon under these circumstances in response to our giving the Ukrainians long-range ATACMS in sufficient quantities. Eric?
Definitely not in response to that.
Right.
Are there scenarios where Russia might consider it? Probably, but none that seem particularly plausible at the moment. I mean, just zooming out, does Russia have red lines? Yes, every country has red lines. Are they where we thought they were 2 years ago when this war started? Clearly not. Do we know where they are? No. And so just to kind of, emphasize what Dara was saying, I think you have to look at the totality of the decisions we've made, the decisions the Ukrainians made, the Russian reactions, and you continue to pump that data into your equation and see where it comes out. And, decision makers in the administration have to weigh how that risk equation plays out based on what they know. They have to weigh what the utility is for the Ukrainians. And again, limitations on our side in the stockpile. And I think when you contrast the potential Russian, campaign against Russian sites against the Ukrainian campaign in Crimea to destroy Russian military sites there, which were in a much more concentrated area where the risk of escalation was deemed to be lower. So the Ukrainians could actually achieve something with less risk of escalation. And the decision was made to support that. In this case, it's a much larger swath of territory. This is how I've heard it explained. Much larger swath of territory, limited number of missiles with a higher risk of escalation. And when they plug that into their sort of mental math, the juice yet hasn't been worth the squeeze. But again, this is a dynamic situation. The war changes all the time, and plenty of things that the Russians do causes us to reassess our own position. So I think if we end up enabling Ukrainian strikes into Russia, it will be entirely because what Russia has done has prompted us to reconsider, because they have this unrelenting attack against Ukraine's energy grid and so on and so forth.
Right. I left the most complicated question to as usual, not at what I would call a deft management of time here. And that's the issue of sustainability. So look, we're clearly faced with, I think, what we could all agree would be a long war. So to me, a foundational question emerges. Can the U.S. and the West sustain the level of support that we've given Ukraine over the past several years? If the answer is yes, we don't have time, I wish we did, to talk about the outcome of November 5th and how that could change U.S. policy. I mean, it's just as well. I mean, there's a lot of it is a thought experiment. But if the answer is yes, that we are committed to do this, what's the best package of economic and political and resource tools that you could at least briefly conceptualize that will able to do this? We're going to need congressional support, and this is where obviously politics do matter. Dara, to you first, and I'll leave the final word to Eric.
I'm going to cede my time to Eric because he's done a lot of excellent work on this exact question.
All right, I appreciate that. Eric.
Lucky me. Can we sustain it? From a resource perspective, yes. I mean, this is still a very small portion of our defense budget and overall government spending to deal with what is the most pressing national security crisis of the current era. And so, again, from a resource perspective, assuming we make the right decisions on defense production and so on, we can definitely sustain it. Can we sustain it politically is the central question you're asking. And on that, I'm not sure. I think there is still strong bipartisan support to continue backing the Ukrainians and not to let the Russians have a victory here. I think the outcome of the election in November will have significant ramifications for, our strategic kind of policy on Russia and level of support for Ukraine. But I do think that there are voices on both sides of the aisle that think that we should get this, U.S. policy towards this conflict from this emergency paradigm to a longer term framework, some of the stuff that I've been working on. And I would urge, viewers to take a look at the text of the bill that was recently introduced just last week by Senators Blumenthal and Graham, which is sort of this effort to codify the bilateral security agreement that Presidents Biden and Zelensky signed in June, and to put U.S. support for Ukraine on a more predictable kind of long-term footing with this more regularized dialogue between Congress and the executive branch. If something like that were to become law, you can imagine us settling into something where we have an annual discussion on, Ukraine's military objectives, what can be achieved over the next year, how's our defense production doing, what do they need resourcing wise, what are the allies doing, and how do we resource this properly?
Yeah.
And then that continuing forward. So again, I think we can do it. The question is whether we have the political will and the ability for both parties and both branches of government to talk to each other and iron out, some of the, mostly political and non-substantive disagreements that they have.
Well, the next time we have the two of you on, we will be facing, regardless of who wins, a different political reality, and we'll have to carry the conversation forward from there. I want to thank you, Eric, and you, Dara, for participating. You make us all a lot smarter. And to those viewers, Carnegie Connects, October 2nd, I'll be sitting down with Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell to talk about the range of issues in the Biden administration's foreign policy. So again, Eric and Dara, thanks so much. Until next time.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.